I'm Joe. Welcome to Drupal Camp, Wisconsin. Yeah, this is going to be awesome. So like Alan said, I do a lot of teaching people how to use Drupal. And so I'm particularly sensitive to the fact that Drupal is, at least by a lot of people, perceived as being pretty hard to learn. And I want to talk a little bit about sort of my experience with that and why I think Drupal is hard to learn. Some of the things that the Drupal community is doing currently to try to make it easier, and share some tips with you guys, especially related to attending events like this and being involved in the community, and how that can help make it easier to learn Drupal. The summary of this presentation is, we're going to talk about why learning Drupal is hard. This is a little bit contentious in that it really depends on who you talk to. Like, you'll definitely meet people who are like, oh no, Drupal's really easy, it's not hard. You'll meet other people who are like, wow, Drupal, that's like the hardest thing I ever learned how to do, and I'd like to never touch it again. It's interesting for me because I learned Drupal probably 10 plus years ago at this point, and so I often find that it's difficult for me to remember what the experience was like for me when I first got started. But I do get to talk to a lot of people who are at some point along their journey in learning Drupal, and hear kind of firsthand what that experience is like for them. At the end of the day, I think learning Drupal is hard, and I think that we can make it easier. I think there are probably things that are harder than learning Drupal, like maybe, for example, chemistry. But the sort of premise of the talk is that whether you think it's hard to learn or not, the important thing is that we take the time to understand why some people perceive Drupal as hard to learn, so that we can make informed decisions and make it easier for people as we go forward. I'm really passionate about this subject for a number of reasons. Probably the biggest one is that I feel like if we take the time to understand what it is that makes Drupal hard, or at least makes some people perceive Drupal as being hard, we have the opportunity to improve that. And when we improve that, ultimately we get to make Drupal better. And making Drupal better for me kind of always ties back to one of the reasons that I got involved with the Drupal community in the first place and became interested in contributing was, it was really cool to me that I could contribute code to a project like Drupal and have the things that I was doing and the problems that I was solving impact somebody else and their ability to publish something on the web. So I was able to solve a problem like, for example, making it so people could add images to Drupal without installing like 50 different modules. And by doing that, I was able to empower people who didn't have that skill to create websites of their own and have their voice heard and publish things on the web. And so I feel similarly about it now. I'm maybe not writing as much code, but it is important to me that we figure out how to make Drupal easier to learn, because when we do that, more people can learn how to use it. And the more people that can learn how to use it, the more people that have the opportunity to get their voice heard, which is super cool. I'm also in a kind of unique position in respects to this, in that I'm a member of the documentation working group for Drupal, so I spend a lot of time helping to figure out where the pain points are in Drupal's documentation and try to address those with like policy decisions and kind of making sure that work is happening to improve that. And I'm a trainer. I work for Drupalize Me, like we mentioned, and I spend a lot of time teaching people Drupal. Those two things combined mean I'm also in a position where a lot of people complain to me about how hard Drupal is. I'm not disagreeing with you. Let's work on making it easier. And so let's talk a little bit about that. Excuse me. I also want to, before I get too far down this track of bashing on Drupal for being difficult, I do want to point out that to some extent I think it's okay that Drupal's difficult, or that there are things in Drupal that are hard. And you have to kind of take that all into picture, is that Drupal is a really powerful tool that can do a whole bunch of different things. It's super flexible. With that complexity, though, of course, is going to come the complication of you need to understand how those tools work. If our main goal was to make Drupal as easy as possible to learn, all we need to do is delete everything in the root directory and here's a directory, it's Drupal. And like everybody knows how to use a directory. It wouldn't be able to do anything, but that's really easy to teach people. The thing is, that's not our goal. Our goal is to build a tool that can empower people to build websites for themselves. And a tool like Drupal happens to be super flexible, and with that flexibility comes complexity. And so I think for me, it's more about making sure that we take the time to evaluate the things that people perceive as hard with Drupal, and look at them with a critical eye towards, is there a good reason for this to be hard? Because in some cases there might be. Like, it just turns out that building rockets is hard, no matter how you look at it. But there are other things that we can say, you know what? It's silly that there are 16 different ways to render a URL as a link in Drupal 8. Maybe we should work on making one or two and all agree on standardizing that. So kind of keeping that in mind that, like, yes, I think Drupal's hard, but I also don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. The other thing about this is that it's really hard to measure, to give a number to how hard something is. I've tried to do this a few times, especially with Drupal, and it's particularly interesting in an open source community where a lot of decision making happens by consensus, and when it comes to making decisions by consensus, it's way easier if you can point to a chart or a graph that has some like definitive data and numbers and say, I know you don't believe me, but look, you have to believe this spreadsheet because spreadsheets don't lie. It's hard to measure how complicated something is to learn, and it's very subjective because it depends on each person and what they bring to the table with them when they're going to learn it. If you've got an advanced degree in computer science and you've spent years as a PHP developer, learning to be a Drupal module developer is going to be a lot easier than it is for someone that has never written a line of code in their life. So you have to keep that in mind. But I do think it's important for us to be able to have some kind of measure so that we can, as a community, talk about, like, yes, this thing is difficult. No, this thing is not difficult. And, you know, but is it like, we can't necessarily say, here's the 0 to 10 scale that we use to measure how complicated Drupal is. It's kind of like, it's like hard to harder, and it's all somewhere in between. There has been a lot of attempts to try to find ways to quantify how difficult Drupal is or is not. One of them that I'm fairly familiar with are the usability tests that have taken place at the University of Minnesota. In conjunction with the Drupal camp that happens there, on a couple of occasions, we've been able to partner with the usability research lab at the university and do some testing on a couple different versions of Drupal. I have not participated directly. I've helped to sort of facilitate the fact that they've happened, and so I've heard a lot about what happened in the testing, but I was never actually present for it. But these sort of tests give us the opportunity to put Drupal into a situation where you can kind of test and evaluate multiple people's experience trying to use it and try to quantify. It was hard for them to create a block, or it was not hard for them to create a block. This works by, in this case anyways, what happened was we tested Drupal with a handful of people who had some experience working with content management systems, like WordPress or Moodle or something, but not with Drupal. They had never used Drupal before, but they had used some content management system before. And then they were given tasks and asked to try to accomplish these tasks via Drupal. And the tasks were worded in order to try to not give away too much, like not use Drupal-specific terminology, like, for example, entity or content type. So the task might be, create a new form that lets people submit some content, and they should be able to post an event on the site. And it's like, oh, I know what you're talking about. You mean a new content type named event with a date field. Yeah. But we tried to not say those things so that people would have to test the UI and see if it was user interface. They would test that and see, like, can we accomplish these tasks? And the result was pretty much overwhelmingly no. They could not accomplish these tasks, which wasn't necessarily a surprise to us, but it was a nice confirmation of the fact that, you know, we had been saying we think this is difficult. Now we had a little bit of a way to quantify it, at least. We got these really cool heat maps where you could see where people were, like, looking at the screen, and they would record people's thoughts. That's not possible. They would ask people to speak out loud what they were thinking, and they would record that. And then we could analyze those recordings, and someone would be like, I'm going to click on this link because I think when I do, it's going to take me to a page where I can do X. In the other room, but like behind the one-way window, they're like, no, don't click there. We learned some interesting things though about things that we could change about Drupal that would help to make it more intuitive. Making it more intuitive will also hopefully help make it easier to learn, or at least as far as I'm concerned, it means there are less things that you have to learn first, because you can just kind of sit down and using your intuition and your previous experience using a computer, you can kind of figure out, oh, okay, these are terms that I'm familiar with, and I can pretty much figure out how this works. A good example of that would be, we learned a lot about the fact that Drupal has a tendency to expose sort of implementation details that are really kind of meaningless to people that aren't writing the code in the background. Drupal's field API, so if you've ever created a new content type and tried to add fields to the content type, you've experienced, at least in Drupal 8, you've experienced this option before. It's a big select list that says, what kind of field do you want to add to this content type? And it gives you a bunch of values. And the values are all named after basically the type of data that it's going to store in the data storage system when somebody submits the form. And you're mostly like, I don't know, like I want text, but I don't know which of these 6 text options I would like. It turned out that a lot of people were like, what I really want to do is add a checkbox to the form. And they didn't equate checkbox with, oh, you mean I need to add a Boolean. In fact, a lot of people didn't even necessarily know what Boolean meant. One of the participants went and Googled Boolean and was like, oh, well, now I know what that is, but I still don't know how to add a checkbox. So we can do some pretty easy things. We could make some changes that would hopefully make it less frustrating for people to get started learning by maybe changing something like this so that instead of saying Boolean, we said, would you like to add a checkbox to the form? And there's definitely work being done in the community to make these types of changes, to make Drupal more intuitive. But no matter how intuitive Drupal's user interface is, eventually you're going to have to start learning some things that are new. And based on my experience teaching Drupal for a while and all the anecdotal evidence that I've been able to gather from students that we've taught and people that have written in emails to support and people that like to complain on Twitter about how complicated Drupal is or is not, we've compiled this chart, which I think illustrates what the experience is like for most people, I guess, that are trying to learn Drupal. I don't actually believe this at all. But I do think it's a hilarious graphic that kind of conveys the general sentiment in the community, which is like, man, Drupal is so complicated, nobody could ever possibly figure this out. But like WordPress, that's super easy. All you do is install it and like, ta-da, you're a WordPress developer. It's like, well, no, it's also equally complicated. But to me, this represents the fact that our community does have this sort of feeling of Drupal's more complicated than it needs to be, and that we should be working on improving that. So this graphic often gets used to represent what is known as the Drupal learning cliff. Again, I think this stuff is hard to measure and to put numbers on, and it's hard to say, this is what a graph of the journey that someone takes to learn Drupal looks like. But I do think that we can try to quantify this in some ways by talking about the path that we take when we learn Drupal and looking for the points along that path where it's complicated. I believe that this graphic is a little bit more realistic example of the path that most people take when they're learning Drupal. The idea for this came from some reading that I had done by a gentleman named Eric Troutman who wrote a post. It's a really long article about why learning to code is so difficult and why all of these free learn to code boot camps are lying to you because you can't actually learn to code and be a developer in 6 weeks, even no matter how hard you try. So that, and then there's another book by Seth Godin called The Dip, where he has a similar graphic that talks about challenging things that you're going to encounter in life. He actually uses this graphic to represent, like, when you get to this point in the graphic, you should probably just give up. We're going to use this to say, when you get to this point, here's how you can persevere if you want to continue learning Drupal. So the graphic illustrates, from the beginning, over on the left, this is someone who's like new to Drupal and they're just starting on their journey to learn Drupal. And you've got to do two things to get to the point where you're, we're going to call it job ready, but whatever your goal is with Drupal. Job ready being essentially you have enough skills to be considered a Drupal developer, but you also have enough confidence in your skills that you are willing to fill out a resume and submit it to a job. And those are kind of two important but very different things. So across the bottom, you've got competence, the skills that you need to learn. The whole, vertical axis is your confidence in those skills. And the path that most people take ends up being something like this. You start out with like a real rapid gain in confidence when you're learning basic things, basic terminology. I got Drupal installed and I submitted a form and I created some content and I logged in and it was actually not that difficult. And I'm really proud of myself for having accomplished that. Your confidence goes up really quick. But then you get this sort of like quick drop off, kind of related to this curve that we saw before. Just turn the other direction. It's like you climbed up to the top and then they're like, just keep going until you fall. Where you kind of have a rapid decrease in confidence, followed by a long period of time where you're struggling with, there's a lot of things that you need to learn, and you need to piece them all together in some way that makes sense, until you finally get to the point where you've sort of, the things are starting to gel enough that your confidence starts to increase, though this time it's a much slower increase. This is kind of the like, all right, you just got to put in the time and gain the experience until you feel like you have enough confidence in your skills. And I think that the reason that a lot of people view Drupal as difficult is because of the shape of this curve and the process that they go through to learn Drupal. Specifically this chunk in the middle where you've got this long period of time where you've got a lot of skill to learn but very little confidence in your ability to accomplish those things. And I think that the reason that there's this big dip in the middle here is that there's sort of an inverse relationship between the scope of knowledge that you need, so the number of things that you need to understand in Drupal, and the resources, the density of resources that are available to you to learn those things. Let's walk through each of these phases a little bit and talk about the types of things that you're going to be learning in these phases and what we can do to make each of them easier. So the first phase, when you set out to learn Drupal, we're going to call this phase the hand-holding phase or like the honeymoon phase. It's basically you're first getting started with Drupal. Your goal is to learn a bunch of basic concepts, things that are fundamental to understanding Drupal, but still relatively basic. You need to learn like, what is a node? How do I create a piece of content? As a module developer, you need to learn like what is a hook and how do I implement a hook. You're learning a lot of how in this phase. And you can generally learn these things really quickly because there's a lot of really awesome resources available to do so. Things like the tutorial videos that are available on Drupal.me, which basically set out a defined goal. Like by the end of this, you will have implemented this hook with the text hello world in it. And here's the step-by-step instructions to accomplish that. And as long as you're a relatively astute reader, you can follow these instructions and you're pretty much guaranteed success. But success feels really good because you're like, all right, I accomplished my goal and I wrote this module. So you gain a lot of confidence really quickly. And you're also gaining a lot of fundamental knowledge, that kind of like real basic understanding. But ultimately, you're going to progress into the second phase of learning here. And this is really like representative of, I've followed a lot of these highly polished resources, and that was really great. But now I need to step out into the real world and start solving some of my own problems. I can't just copy and paste your module anymore. I now need to write my own module. Or I can't just create the content type and views that you did for your blog. I need the things that are specific to the problem that I'm trying to solve. And a lot of times this is kind of comes with a painful realization that while you have a lot of fundamental knowledge, your ability to apply it in situations where you don't have that hand-holding isn't quite as solid as you thought it was. And so what ends up happening is you spend a lot of time kind of debugging problems and fumbling around, and ultimately you step off what we're going to refer to as the cliff of confusion. And it's basically just, what happens is, you've basically at this point learned enough to make available a bunch of new resources. Like for example, the Drupal documentation and api.drupal.org and websites like Stack Exchange. You can finally sort of grasp that these resources are available and they're trying to answer my question, but the problem is after I read the answer on Stack Exchange, I didn't get my question answered and now I have like 50 more questions too because they said a lot of words and I don't really know what those things are. So now instead of solving my problem, I actually have to go research like 50 other things before I can decide how to solve my own problem. And it just gets really frustrating, and it kind of often results in a really rapid decrease of your confidence in your ability to accomplish things with Drupal. So you fall off the cliff, and you smash yourself on the rocks at the bottom, and you wake up a couple of days later, and you find yourself wandering around in what we're going to refer to as the desert of despair. This is, in the journey of learning Drupal, this is the phase where you're kind of wandering around in this sort of like pathless landscape. There's a lot of options, but you don't really know what any of them mean. But you need to try all of them out a little bit to try to get some understanding. And there's no real good map to guide you through it. I guess in the Drupal world, this would be things like, you know how to implement a hook in a module, but you don't necessarily know which hook you need to implement. And there's like roughly 5,000 of them to choose from. You know how to add fields to a content type, but you don't necessarily understand the implication of choosing a text field versus an integer field, or using a taxonomy reference field versus using a text field with a select list, and how that's going to impact the things that you are building further down. And the problem is, you need to understand those things to feel confident in your decisions and that you are answering the question appropriately. And the only way to really gain that knowledge is to try them all out. So now the problem is, you have to try like all 15 of the different form-related hooks before you can decide, this is the one that I wanted. So you have all these paths that you have to go down a little bit and test things out, and then go, nope, it wasn't that one, so you back up. And you try another one, you go, nope, it wasn't that one. Should I install panels or contacts? Then you install both of them, and you realize, well, that was a bad decision. Now I need to pick one of the two. This phase is often, for me, this is the like, you don't know what you don't know. And the problem with that is that if you don't know what you don't know, you also don't know what to Google for, which means you can't find answers to your question. It's like, the problem here is like, I need to figure out what words to put into the search box in Google so someone can tell me the answer to my question. And this really results in there being a big lack of resources. And it's not that they don't exist, it's just that they become really hard to find because you don't know the right words to use to find them. Or, for example, you're trying to create a link to something in Drupal 8. You know that that's what you're doing, so you Google for an answer, and the api.drupal.org returns a whole list of possible results, but now you've got to weed through all of them and figure out, well, all of these appear like they would solve my problem. And the truth is, they all probably would, and you could probably use any of the methods and have it work, but you need to pick one, and you need to be confident in that choice to feel like, all right, I'm making progress, and I'm gonna get there. I'm gonna be a Drupal developer one of these days. Eventually, and this is kind of the reason that this is particularly difficult, I think, for Drupal, and why this period of time gets extended out for so long for a lot of people who are learning Drupal, is because Drupal has a tendency to be pretty ambiguous. That is, it's super flexible and it can do a lot of different things, but you're often presented with the scenario where you need to make the decision between 1 or 2 different modules, or really like between 10 or 15 different modules. You need to choose the one that's going to solve your problem. Maybe you're setting out to build a photo gallery, so you install the photo gallery module, and you get about halfway through and you're like, man, I don't like the way this one makes thumbnails, so I'm going to install the better photo gallery module. So you delete the photo gallery module and you install the better photo gallery module, and you get partway down that path, and then you eventually realize, yeah, actually what I should really be doing is building this photo gallery with content types and views and creating my own image styles. But I don't even know what those things are, and which ones to use. Drupal gives you a lot of choices, which I think is a good thing, because it means Drupal can solve a huge set of problems and work for a diverse set of people in a lot of very different ways. But it also means that, to some extent, you just have to accept the fact that Drupal is going to be difficult to learn in that scenario. The benefit is, if you're willing to put in the time, and you're willing to try a lot of these different solutions and go a little bit down each path, you'll eventually be rewarded with the ability to master a really powerful tool, but you do have to put in the time. And again, there's this I think there's often this idea that people want to set out to be a Drupal developer, and they go, all right, I'm going to be a Drupal developer, I'm going to take some training on a site like Drupal ID, or I'm going to read the documentation, and then once I get to the end of the documentation, I'll be a Drupal developer. But the truth is, like, you can't learn this stuff in a day or a week or probably even a year. Being a developer, being a Drupal user, and feeling like you've mastered Drupal is a process that takes a long time and a lot of commitment because there's so much that you need to learn. But eventually, you'll make progress, you'll wander around in the desert long enough, and you'll go down enough paths, and you'll leave yourself little markers as you go. Like, I tried panels once, and this is what I learned about it, so I know at least enough to know, like, that's a possible solution when I encounter this type of problem. I've used content types in Drupal enough to realize, like, this is, some good ways to architect my site. And you start to gain confidence in your abilities again, because you're able to actually solve real problems. You're able to produce a website. You're like, yeah, I solved the problem that I needed, and my website is ready to launch. And so you start to gain confidence. In this phase, the types of things that you're learning now are more like, not how do I do this, or even why, but more like best practices. You've built this house of cards out of all of the knowledge that you've learned walking around in the desert, and now your job is to like glue all the cards together and make sure that the house doesn't come tumbling down. You can build a website, but now you need to be able to launch a website into production that's going to be ready to handle the load of the thousands of users that are going to come read your awesome blog post about why Drupal is complicated or whatever it is that you choose to write about. And so it's really about learning best practices and continuing to grow your own confidence until you get to the point where you say, all right, I feel like I've learned enough of this. I know a lot about Drupal. I've learned a lot of best practices. I feel confident in my skills. I can solve real-world problems, and I have enough confidence that I'm willing to submit my resume to get a job or whatever it was that you kind of set out for in the first place. This phase in particular also ends up being fairly difficult for a lot of people. I think because this is the point where you realize there's a lot more to being good at Drupal than just Drupal. You can use Drupal to do a lot of different things, but not if you don't have a web server to run the Drupal site on. And you can build a really great website, but you can only put great content on the website if you're a good writer and can write the content. There's an element of like, you can watch a bunch of videos that teach you how to use the color picker tool in Photoshop and like apply a color to some item on the page. And then you can spend the next 5 years learning how to pick which color to apply on that item to make it actually look good. And there's a similar element of that in Drupal. It's like you can learn how to do all of the things in Drupal, but then it still takes a really long time to learn how to do good things with Drupal. And there's just so much knowledge that's kind of tangential to Drupal itself that you need to learn, which again makes it difficult. I kind of mentioned this earlier, but this graphic for me illustrates like through each of these phases, this represents like the amount of knowledge or the scope of knowledge that you need to pass through any of these. And so you can see kind of at the beginning, you don't really need to learn a whole lot of stuff to get the fundamentals out of the way. It's a bunch of basic terminology and sort of relatively easy skills like how to log into your Drupal site. But then as you move into the second and third phases, what you learn is that the further you delve into Drupal, the more you expose that you don't know and that you now need to learn. And the problem is that as you're kind of progressing through here, and especially like into this third phase, the resources that are available to teach it to you become harder and harder to find. And it's not because they don't exist necessarily, it's because you don't have the right words to find them. I did this exercise where I tried to come up with like a list of all of the different ways that I thought people could learn things about Drupal and then try to catalog them based on which phase in the learning cycle I thought they would be useful for. And I also, at Lullabout, we've got an internal discussion board, and I posted basically I posed this question to everyone at Lullabout, and I said, what resources would you recommend for someone that's in these various phases, and applied that all. It's relatively generic, but to me it illustrated like, in the beginning there's a ton of really awesome resources. Drupal.org and all of the tutorials that are there, and all of these different sites like Drupalize Me and Build a Module and the Acquia Academy, and there's just tons of resources that are like If you want to log into Drupal, just follow these 5 easy steps, and then you'll be a Drupal developer. And ultimately, you learn enough knowledge from those to be able to make use of resources like the Drupal forum, where you can go and ask questions, or Stack Exchange, where you can ask questions. Log into IRC and say, man, you guys, how do I do this? And someone will answer your question. The problem then is that they'll answer your question with a whole bunch, by basically presenting you with a whole bunch of new questions that you now need to solve. In the third phase, I would say probably the best resources are the Drupal documentation, especially if you're trying to become a developer, being able to read the stuff on api.drupal.org, and also being good at using a debugger to be able to step through the code and looking at code examples. And that's all really great, but the problem is you have to even Drupal's documentation assumes that you have some baseline of knowledge, so you have to know enough about Drupal to be able to read the documentation and have it be useful to you. This is especially true, again, of things like api.drupal.org, which documents all of Drupal's code and APIs. It's really, really good documentation, but only if it makes sense when you read it. And one of the things that kept coming up over and over during these discussions that I've had with people about trying to get through these phases is that in this third phase, almost everyone said the resource, or the thing that ultimately ended up helping them make it through the desert of despair, was peers. Working with other people and getting feedback from other people that have used Drupal or that are currently using Drupal. Almost without fail, every single person I talked to at Lullabot said, they started learning Drupal, they got frustrated. It finally started to make sense when they went to a camp and they met someone and they talked, they got some of their questions answered. Or they started working in a company where someone else was doing Drupal, and even though they were on the same level, they could at least bash their heads together instead of against the wall individually and start to make more sense out of things. And so having the opportunity to interact with and talk with other people is what ultimately made Drupal easier in this phase. That's a resource that's really, really hard to scale. And it's why there's less of that available, and it's why this dip becomes so prominent. It's really easy to scale things like, I'm going to create a video and post it on a website, and now it's available to anyone that can get to that website. It's way different than all right, I'm going to stand down here and answer questions for anybody that has questions, but I can only answer so many questions in a 24-hour period, and it's just, it doesn't scale nearly as well. We confirmed this a little bit at Drupalize Me. We did an experiment, or it's kind of an ongoing experiment, where we've been offering what we refer to as support memberships. And so for an increased price, you get the opportunity to, it's an experiment. We've got lots of different variations of this, but it's for this price, you can have access to email us your questions. For this price, we'll hop on a Hangout and talk to you about it. For this price, you can just send us your questions and we'll fix them and send them back. We went into this thinking this is going to be awesome. A bunch of organizations that have 20 people are going to sign up for this because they want to be able to, the manager wants to say, oh, you'll support everybody, and then no one will actually call us, and they'll be paying us a bunch of money, but we won't have to answer any questions, and it's going to be great. And what ended up happening was no organization signed up. In fact, we can't even get them to be slightly interested in it. But what we did discover is that individuals, people who aren't part of an organization, were all over this. And it was the opportunity to have someone to talk to was so valuable to them that they were just willing to jump on and be yeah, totally. Can I ask you my question right now? And it's whoa, hold on a second. And it's been successful. It's something that it's tough for us to scale that even in a way that can be economical, that we can continue to support enough people to make it worthwhile. But it was at least confirmed this sort of bias that I had where I thought, the thing that people really want to do is help get mentored by other people. And that's one way to help them through the difficulty of learning Drupal. So anyway, that graphic is kind of my thoughts about the process, the journey that most people go through when they're learning Drupal, based on conversations that I've had over the years with a lot of people. And it's different for everyone, right? Because people have different goals and they bring different skills to the table when they set out to learn it. And so your peaks may be a little bit higher, or your valleys may be a little bit lower, but ultimately, it's a graph that looks something like that. It's an initial, like, yeah, I'm really confident in this, followed by some frustration and some time fumbling around, ultimately coming to an answer. I would also say that I've seen this apply not just to like learning Drupal as a whole, but like this applies to me on a daily basis where I'm running, I need to debug this particular problem with some code that I've been working on. And I set out, and I'm like, oh, I'm sure that that's in the video module. Like I was working on that the other day, it must be there. And I go and I start poking around and I'm pretty confident. And I'm like, no, actually, I don't think I have any idea what's going on here. And then fall down into that sort of pit of despair and fumble around for a while I try to coalesce enough information together that I can't ultimately come to an answer. And so that, to me, it applies not just to the entire journey, but to lots of little steps along the way in the journey of learning Drupal. So my thinking is like, okay, cool, we all agree, like that sucks. Nobody wants to be stuck wandering around in the desert without a bottle of water. What if we set up a bunch of water stations in the desert so they could at least find them? Can we make a map so that people can just, like once they fall off the cliff, they just get a copy of the map and then they walk out the other side of the desert? It only takes them a couple of weeks. And the answer is, I don't think we can. And I think this is part of accepting that there's some element of Drupal that it's just going to be hard to learn. Because everybody's goals are different, and the tools that they're going to need to get there are going to be different. And with something that's like as flexible and as ambiguous as Drupal is, I don't see a good way for us to create one map that's going to work for everyone. I think that ends up being a little bit of a side effect of this goal in Drupal, which is Drupal is built by everyone for everyone. And for a very long time, there's always been this idea that like anybody should be able to use Drupal to create anything that they want to, versus if we said, Drupal is the tool for librarians, creating the map to help people through that dip would be a lot easier because we know what their goals are. We know the types of words that they're probably going to want to see in the user interface. We can write documentation that makes sense to them because we can, make analogies to things that they're already familiar with. But when Drupal is for everyone, that becomes much harder to do. There has been some rumbling, I suppose, in the community lately, and not even lately. This comes up quite frequently, this idea that at some point, is it important for Drupal to pick a target audience and to cater towards that target audience? And it seems like this is becoming a point of conversation again. Dries Boytart, the founder of Drupal, in one of his recent keynote presentations, presented some evidence that we'll call it evidence. He presented some data that he had gathered from a survey that was sent out to tons of people that use Drupal. And one of the questions was, who should Drupal favor when making product decisions? Kind of getting at this idea of, maybe at some point, if we want to continue to make it better and easier, we are going to need to narrow the focus of who are we making it better and easier for. That's not necessarily to say it can't still be for everyone, but if we are able to say pick a target, which in this case ended up being, the content authors should be the target. But if you were able to even further narrow that down, and it's like content authors who are writing content for this type of organization, the more that we can narrow it down, of course, the better resources we can make and the easier we can make it for people to learn Drupal. But that comes with a trade-off. Like when you make a decision like that, and you say, you know what, Drupal's for libraries. That excludes this whole everybody else that isn't a library. And I know for myself, like that's not awesome. For me, Drupal represents a tool that can empower anyone to put their message out on the web, not just libraries. And so I'm willing to accept in a lot of cases that there are going to be things that are more difficult because we're not focusing in that way. Excuse me. But this is sort of an example of, I think that the community is starting to recognize that one of the things we need to do in order to continue to make Drupal easier to learn is get better at picking a target, who our audience is and who we're trying to help learn Drupal. And that will start to make it easier. Other things that are happening in the community right now, there's, I talked a little bit about usability at the beginning and the studies that have been done. Hello? And the studies that are being done there to try to make Drupal's user interface easier and more intuitive. There's also this, what we refer to in the community as developer experience, which is kind of the code equivalent to usability, which is let's make our APIs and our code and our documentation more intuitive so that you don't necessarily have to learn and you can just kind of figure it out. Make the experience of using those things better. I don't remember where this phrase came from exactly, but I've always really liked this idea of in the developer experience world right now, there's a lot of momentum towards making the common easy and the uncommon possible. So focusing on making the things that people are doing 75 or 80% of the time really, really easy. Pretty much everyone that writes code for Drupal ever is probably going to create a form. Turns out you use forms on the web a lot to do everything. So we should make it really easy for people to figure out how to create forms and make the experience of doing so really awesome. Drupal has the flexibility to allow you to swap out the storage backend for each of your fields individually, so you can decide, you know, this field, I'd like it stored in Redis, and this field, I'd like it stored in MySQL, and this field, I'd like it stored like in an envelope in my mailbox. Which is cool, because it allows people to do that in cases where they need to, but it's relatively uncommon. So we should make it possible for people to do that, but we shouldn't necessarily invest as much time and energy in worrying about whether that's hard or not. There's an aspect of, like, once you're to the point in your Drupal development career that you realize that the thing that you need to do is swap out the data storage underlying Drupal for something different, like you're now at a point where you could probably figure out how to do that just by opening up Drupal and starting to read the code, because the knowledge that you have at that point is so large. So we don't need to worry quite as much about solving those things. I kept coming to this example earlier, but this has been happening in Drupal 8 a lot. And, one of my favorite examples of that is if you ever want to create a link to something in Drupal 8, so whether that's an internal page or some external page, whether you're using a route or a URL to get there, you need to ultimately write some code that's going to generate a link for you, and so an anchor tag and an href and spit it out on the page. And so I had to figure this out recently. I don't remember exactly what the scenario was, but so I went to Drupal, api.drupal.org, and I was like, all right, I want to create a link. And within like 10 minutes, I found like, I'm not making this up. There was like 12 plus different ways that I could find that you could take a route and generate an anchor tag. And I was like, holy cow, none of these are just write an anchor tag, which I know how to do. But all of them are like basically the same thing, like feed in a route and it'll spit out an anchor tag. How do I figure out which one of these I want to use? And this is, I think, stuff like this is a little bit of an artifact of the Drupal development process, where over the course of Drupal 8's development lifecycle, the way that this was accomplished has changed. And Drupal core's code hasn't always done a great job of keeping up with those changes. As a community, we said, yeah, that way isn't the best. Let's introduce a new way, but don't always do a great job of going back and updating all of the previous stuff. And that's difficult for people that are learning Drupal, like myself, who say, okay, well, there's like 12 different ways. I'll just see which one core uses, and I'll use that, because that's probably the best way. And then I'm like, wow, core uses all of them. I still can't decide which one I should use. What's happening right now, so in current versions of Drupal 8, so like 8.1 and 8.2 is even better, this is improving, because as a community, we've said, well, this is dumb. Let's pick one or two and standardize on that. And we can do so by saying, all right, these are the two that will solve all the problems and they're the right way to do it. Let's update all of core to use one of those two ways. And then let's go back and at least mark all of the old ways as deprecated, so that when someone like me comes across it in the API documentation, and I'm like, all right, this one looks awesome, I'm like, no, actually it says it's deprecated, go use this one instead. There's a much clearer path forward. Those types of improvements make Drupal easier to learn because they reduce the number of paths that I have to go down and test out before I make a decision. And that's really cool. And continuing to do those types of things is going to continue to make Drupal easier. And so one of the things that I often like to remind people is when you find yourself in that scenario where you're like, all right, there's like 5 different ways to do this, and I don't know which one is the obvious one. If it seems like you should be able to just, if like all 5 ways are basically the same result, and it's just you need to pick one for whatever reason, to me that's representative of a bug in Drupal, and you should be able to say, you know, why are there 5 ways to do this? Are they slightly different? Is there a good reason that there's 5 ways to do this? And there might be. In a lot of cases, there probably is. You know, they have slight variations and one is better than the other in certain scenarios. And if that's the case, that's fine. But at least we've done the due diligence to say, this is hard for a good reason, instead of this is just hard because we forgot to go back and fix it. So if you ever feel like you see something that represents that, bring it up so that we are reminded that that's a thing and we should take a look at it and say, yeah, you're right. This is hard for no good reason. Or at least we can say, it's hard because it needs to be to facilitate these things that we, as the community, have all agreed on we want to make sure Drupal is capable of doing. That's one thing that you as an individual and we as a community can do in order to help make Drupal easier to learn. Another thing that we can do is be mentors for others in the community. Taking the time to attend events like this where you get to meet other people in the Drupal community and others that are also on this journey of learning Drupal. And the truth is, like, even someone like myself who's been doing Drupal for over 12 years, I'm still on my journey to learn Drupal. New versions come out regularly. You know, Drupal 8 came out not that long ago, and I'm in the same boat as a lot of people where I'm now trying to figure out which of the 12 different ways to make a link is the right one. And being able to talk to other people who are experiencing that same thing is a great way for me to learn a bit about how to make those choices. Being a mentor also doesn't mean you need to be a Drupal wizard that can answer all of the questions. You can be a mentor to someone even if you're on the same level as them. A lot of my initial experience learning Drupal, I learned alongside of one of my really good friends. We worked together, Christian and I, and we sat at a desk, and Christian sat on that side of the desk, and I sat on this side of the desk. And we tried to build a website using Drupal 4.5 for a radio station in Minneapolis, and we would like sit down to write some code, and I'd be like, all right, I'm gonna do this thing. And I'd get like 20 minutes into it, and I'd be like, I have no idea what I'm doing. And then Christian would be like, oh, it's okay, I'll figure it out. And then he would spend like 20 minutes on it, and he'd be like, wow, I have no idea what I'm doing either. And then we'd spend 20 minutes talking about it, and we could compare our experiences, and we'd at least make some progress in that way. So being a mentor and taking the opportunity to share your experiences with other people is going to help make their path of learning Drupal easier. When you have that opportunity to talk to people about Drupal or you're being a mentor for someone, I want to encourage you guys to practice tempered humility. When you work with a technology like Drupal and when you spend enough time with it, your knowledge base that you've gained over time, the skills and everything that you've gained from your years of experience with Drupal, whether it's technical knowledge or it's cultural experience or both, those things are your greatest strength as a Drupal developer or a Drupal user because they allow you to, for example, choose between panels and context very rapidly. But they're also your greatest weakness because it's kind of like the Achilles heel of expertise is you can no longer remember what it was like to not be an expert at that thing. And so when you're being a mentor to someone, it's important to take the time to not only say, oh, the answer to your question is hook, form, alter. It's to say the answer to your question is hook, form, alter, and here's how I know that. And here's why it's the answer. So that they can then understand your decision-making process and how you got there. And so when you do have the opportunity to be a mentor, remembering to do that. This has, on a number of occasions for me, has also resulted in scenarios where things that I took for granted, people who I've been trying to teach were able to point it out to me as like, that's really dumb and it's hard for no good reason. One good example of this is I have a lot of experience teaching people how to create themes for Drupal. And a lot of that was for Drupal 6 and Drupal 7. And if you've ever created a theme for either Drupal 6 or Drupal 7, eventually you get to the point where you need to differentiate between a template file, like node.tpl.php, and the template file, template.php. And when you're teaching a class and you're telling people, all right, so what you need to do, if you want to add new variables to your node template file, so you want to add new variables to the template file, all you need to do is add a preprocess function to your template file so that you can get new variables in the template file. And people are like, what? You're like, okay, put the code in the template file so that it shows up in the template file. No, I don't get it. And this was, like, what was funny about this is I got really, really good at explaining that. So that, like, I could within like 5 minutes, I could get everybody in the room like, oh, okay, I know what you're talking about. Like, template.php, that's the template file. That's where I put my PHP code for doing like processing of variables and complex logic and whatever. And then there are template files, and those are the ones that end in .tpl.php. And that's where I've got my HTML markup, etc. And then somebody pointed out one day, they were like, that's dumb. Why don't you just change the name of this file so that we don't have to deal with all of this confusion? And I was like, I don't know why we have, like, I know how to do that. I know how to change the name of that file. And we sat there in the class, and within like 5 minutes, we had come up with a patch for Drupal 8 that changed the file from being named template.php to being the name of your theme.theme. And so now when you teach somebody how to create a theme in Drupal 8, they need to learn, oh, your PHP, that goes in the theme file. And your HTML and printing out of variables, that goes in your template files. And like, you no longer have to spend the time explaining these things. The problem was I was so jaded by the fact that I had spent years doing this and explaining it to people that I never thought about, you know, we could just make this easier by changing the name of the file instead of writing like 10 pages of documentation that allows someone to differentiate between the two. And that's the kind of thing that when you take the time to be a mentor for someone and you practice that tempered humility and you're willing to listen to them, you can say, yeah, that's a good idea. We really can make Drupal easier to learn. I know how to do that. Let's do it together. So the main message that I want people to come away from this presentation with is that learning Drupal is a journey. And it's a journey that's going to take some time, and it's going to have a lot of ups and downs. And the best thing that you can do for yourself in order to make that journey easier and make learning Drupal less hard is be willing to accept the fact that there are going to be points in the process and along this journey where it's just going to be hard and it's going to be frustrating. But if you set out with that knowledge, as opposed to setting out and saying, I'm going to go to Drupal bootcamp and after 6 weeks I'm going to get a job as a Drupal developer. It's like, no, the truth is you really do need to spend years learning this stuff to become an expert. It takes time. And only time and experience is going to give you both the competence and the confidence that you ultimately need. And the best way that I know of to ease that curve and to more quickly get through the difficult parts is by communicating and talking with other people. So I encourage you, when you attend events like this or any chance you get, to find other people that are also somewhere in the Drupal curve, that are on their journey of learning Drupal, and introduce yourself and ask them what they're trying to do and what they're trying to accomplish, and have a conversation and learn a little bit about Drupal from them and teach them a little bit about what you know about Drupal. And when we do that, we teach more people how to use Drupal. Drupal ultimately becomes easier for the next generation of people to use, and as an end result, we end up empowering an even larger number of people to be able to have their voices heard on the web using a tool like Drupal. That's it. Thanks.